Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Crazy Money. I am your host, Paul Ollinger, and I am happy that you are here today. Hey, let me ask you a question. Where do you sit on the social hierarchy? You might not think about it daily, but if I asked you to compare your status to that of one of your friends, you'd probably know the answer. You'd be above some, you'd be below others, but you'd probably be on about the same level as many people. Perhaps you'd follow up with questions like, well, do you mean who has more money, or who has more recognition in the community, or who's more attractive or physically fit? Who has more friends might be the answer to that question. But these requests for clarification demonstrate the nature of status and how we go about gaining it and retaining it, whether we are conscious or not conscious of our efforts to do so. My guest this week is Will Storr. He's the author of a fascinating book called The Status Game, or The Status Game, depending upon whether you live in the United States or the United Kingdom. He's the author of 6 critically acclaimed books, including The Status Game and Selfie and the Science of Storytelling. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Sunday Times, The New Yorker, and The New York Times, and his journalism has been recognized with awards from the National Press Club, the One World Press, and Amnesty International. And if I haven't yet convinced you of his status, I'll also share that he's a great-looking guy who grows giant yams. And you'll understand that reference in about 20 minutes if you stick with me. In this conversation, Will and I discuss why status matters, whether the pursuit of status is a fool's game for small-minded people with totally fragile egos. Why are you looking at me? Don't look at me. We talk about a totally bizarre source of status in Polynesia that demonstrates the arbitrariness and locally relative nature of status. We talk about whether it's better to be a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond. We talk about how the quest for status shows up in politics and religion, and boy, does it ever. And lastly, we discuss how the thirst for status among even the most rich and famous among us, even the likes of Sir Paul McCartney, demonstrate the insatiable need for this elusive and addictive drug that is the status drug. And here to discuss it is Mr. Will Storr. Will Storr, welcome to Crazy Money.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's great to be here.
All right, we're here to talk about your book, The Status Game. So I have to start with a simple question, Will. Is the quest for status a self-indulgent game for insecure people?
No, categorically not.
Oh, thank God. Thank God. Thank God. I was worried. I was very worried about myself here, Will.
I'm going to say status. It's going to be slightly awkward when I'm talking to Americans because we say status and you say status, but we just have to deal with it.
We'll make it work. Let's not talk about soccer and football, for God's sake.
So the quest for status is part of our human nature. You know, we've been doing it for tens of thousands of years, actually longer. We've been competing for status since we were animals, since before we were human. And the quest for status has built civilization. It's built cities, towns, it's made vaccines, it's sent us to space. It can be kind of shallow and self-serving and pointless, but most of the time, it isn't. It can also be a terrible thing. You know, Putin at the moment, his quest for status is putting the safety of the world in danger. But also, Bezos, Musk, the new 21st century space race, that's a kind of positive version of the status game. So, yeah, so it's not shallow and necessarily and self-serving necessarily. The quest for status is the engine of human progress, I would argue.
So when dogs meet each other, they sniff each other in a way to get to know each other and to figure out who's the top dog, right? How do humans go about doing that?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Well, we have an enormous armory of kind of tactics and strategies for doing that. Neuroscientists talk about the brain having this subconscious, they call it a status detection system. So as soon as we get we're in contact with somebody else, it's switching on, and in so many ways we're not even consciously aware of it. We're measuring where we sit versus this person. So it's obvious things like accent, how well we're dressed, all those kind of obvious markers, the watch, all that stuff. But there's also kind of a huge amount of things we're not even conscious of. Like some psychologists have found that there's actually a frequency to our speaking voice that we can't consciously hear, but you can subconsciously pick it up. And what they find is that when you've got a group of people or any more than one person, the highest status person in that group will set the tone, and everybody else's tones will match that person. So this set of psychologists analyzed a series of interviews. Who's that guy? I've forgotten, the really old guy.
Larry King.
Yeah, that's it. Larry King. He never dies. He's like about 175 years old.
Methuselah of CNN.
Yeah, they analyzed the frequencies going on there, and they could tell who he felt superior to and who he kind of felt subservient to by seeing who he matched with and who matched with him.
Yeah. So we play deferential roles when we feel we're not the alpha dog in a group or on a one-on-one kind of conversation.
Yeah. And it's mostly unconscious. So we don't even know that we're doing it.
So when you get an email from out of the blue from some anonymous podcaster in America that you've never heard of before, what kind of status games what's processing in your head going like, is this guy worth my time? Is that a status evaluation, do you think?
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah. It's well, what you do when you approach is you say, look at all these amazing people that I've had on.
That's exactly right. That is a status game.
Yeah, and I look down the list and I go, well, these people are higher status than me, so it's a win for me. So, and it really is as simple as that. I mean, in the book I write about this idea that status leaks, and if we're seen and felt to be in the periphery of people who are higher status than us, then that's good for us. But it also works in the reverse, that those higher status people might see my name on the list and go, damn it, why did I do that Crazy Money podcast? It's really gone downhill.
We all have status that is relative, and there's variables. There's different columns of status, right? So you're a best-selling author of several different books, but you're probably not the wealthiest person that you know, right? So you have relative status in these different areas of your life, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the basic kind of theory of the idea, really, which is that we don't play one status games, we play many status games, and that human life is played up of multiple status games. And fundamentally, how it works is that we have these tribal brains. We've evolved to form groups and to operate in groups, and there used to be a literal group, our tribe, for tens of thousands of years, and now in the modern world, we just form groups. It's just what we do. If you look at human life, whether it's a soccer team or a political team or a national team, Russia versus Ukraine, it's just groups competing for status. That all the way up and down, that's what human life is. It's groups competing for status, and we compete for status within our groups, like versus other players within our game. But also games compete. So when the Republicans win, when the Democrats win, when this baseball team wins versus this baseball team, when our group wins, we personally gain status. And that's why people go so mad about sports, because logically sports doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's just a ball over there and a ball over there. But of course, people, in the UK, you see people, when their teams win, they're grown men in tears. Why? because status is this incredibly important resource that we have. And it matters. It really matters. And these kind of tough men, are devastated when their team wins, because it's their status that's been attacked.
But how does status relate to belongingness? Because that's really about their identity with a tribe, right? I mean, if you're talking about a football club that you care about, I'm a Hotspurs fan or whatever, and then they lose. Does my status take a hit, or is it just that I care so much about my identity with this club that's what hurts?
I don't think you can separate them. So your identity really is the status games that you're playing. Like if you ask people, how do you identify? And what's interesting is when you look at sort of categories like, without wanting to get any political at all, race and gender and sexuality. Sure. Some gay guys identify very strongly as I'm a gay guy, and it's a big part of their identity, and they're really tuned into issues of homophobia and discrimination. But some gay guys couldn't give a toss. They just don't care. It's not part of their identity. So they're not so fussed about that stuff. So it's really interesting for me when you think about your multiple identities. We all have multiple identities, and those identities tend to be the things that, almost always are. I would argue always are the things we plug our status into. Even things like, the idea of the status game is really about social life. It's not really about family life. But even as a parent, like we don't want to be a father and a mother. We want to be a good father and a good mother. That's what's important to us. that we're the above average. So even in when we identify as a father and a mother or a brother and a sister, there's also status built into that. We don't just want to be a dad. We want to be a really great dad.
Right.
And if you don't identify as a father, you probably are a bad father because you don't care about it. You haven't got any of your status plugged into it.
The sources of status in modern Western world are we take for granted, I think, which are, money, success, professional prestige, that kind of thing. And they feel as if they're self-evident truths, right? And yet you present the example of a Polynesian tribe whereby you demonstrate the arbitrariness of status symbols. So why would a guy in a Polynesian island look at another guy and go, God, I wish I had his yams?
Well, that's a really great example that was discovered in this Polynesian island called Pohnpei. I think it was back in the 50s by an anthropologist over there. And it's a great example that just shows you the power of status. So, when we think about, like, your first question was the classic, okay, status is this shallow. I'm thinking about Kim Kardashian. I'm thinking about Kanye West. It's silly. It's ridiculous. But fame and money are but two ways of which we can earn status. Our group, every human group, has a different way of scoring their status. Like in a soccer team, it's how many goals have you scored. If you're like a hip hop artist or in Britain, like a soccer star, one of the ways you're measuring your status is by your income and by the fantastic car that you're driving. But if your status game is like wellness, if you're a meditator and then actually you might look down your nose at people who've got the latest expensive car because what a waste of money, and it's polluting the world.
That's right.
So we all have these different ways of measuring status, and the yam thing is this perfect example of, it's this little island and it's very stratified as most human societies are, top, to the bottom. And it's hard to move around that status game unless you grow a massive yam. And they have these like biannual chiefly feasts. The chief holds these feasts. And if you bring the man who brings the biggest yam to the feast, is literally declared number one. That's what they call him, and he's celebrated. And so what's happened on Pohnpei is that, of course, everybody is obsessed with growing yams, and not only are they obsessed with growing yams, a whole kind of etiquette of morality is blown up around these yams. Like, for example, the yams you're growing for competition are done in secret out in the woods, like in your secret yam pit, and guys get up at 2 a.m. to tend to their secret competition yams. And they're like a secret, like no one's supposed to know where they are. But even the yams that are growing near your house that are small yams that you grow to eat, you're not allowed to look at them. And if someone glances at your yam pit, that's a terrible, moral thing that you shouldn't do. But even more importantly than that, like, they've got really amazingly good at growing yams, and the yams they grow in Pohnpei are so big they have to build special stretchers, and like you've got like a dozen men carrying these massive yams into the feast. So, like, to me, that's an amazing example. Not because it just shows how arbitrary some of these markers are. Like Rolex watches, it tells us time as good as a Casio watch that's going to cost you $8. But it's a marker of status. So it shows you how obsessed we are with status. But I think even more importantly than that, it shows you how unbelievably brilliant the human animal is at playing status games. And, if you plug your status into growing a massive yam, a human being will figure out, or a group of human beings, even more importantly, will figure out how to grow the biggest yams you've ever seen in your life. But if you plug your status into designing a vaccine that's going to solve the COVID pandemic, that's what human beings are going to do. And that is, the core of why we're so incredibly innovative. That's why we've taken over the world. That's why that's why we have iPhones, because we've plugged our status into, or people have plugged their status into solving these incredible problems.
So how did this evolutionary attribute come about?
Well, because we're tribal. So humans are these weird apes. Like we are ape. We're not even some people think we've evolved from the apes, but we technically are apes. But we've obviously not like the rest of the apes. And the difference is that we have solved the problems of highly cooperative living. So unlike the other apes, other apes do live in troops, but our human groups are highly, highly cooperative. And that's why we have language, so we can, coordinate with each other and work in groups. So in the days in which we're evolving, the whole group had to pitch in to if we were going to survive, because life was really tough in those days. It was really hard. Life expectancy was mid-30s. It was hard, and so there had to be a system of kind of incentive, developed to kind of compel people to act not selfishly, but for the tribe, and to innovate and to become really good at stuff. And that's the status game. So in the tribes in which we evolved, there are three main ways that humans earn status. The first one is dominance. So dominance is violence, aggression, the threat of it. That's what animals do mostly. That's a much more animal typical way of, hens when they meet each other peck each other until a pecking order is established. That's dominance. We still do that. That's what's going obviously in Ukraine at the moment. But in the human groups, these kind of prestigious forms of status game arose. Two of them. One is the virtue game. So how selfless are you? How giving are you? How good are you at following the rules? How sincerely do you believe the myths and stories of this tribe? And so, the better you got at playing that game, the higher you rose in status. And then secondarily, the success game. So competence. How good of a hunter are you? How good of a storyteller, a sorcerer? And the better that you got at those games, the higher you raised in status. And what that is a test of is your value to the group. So that's what status is. Status is the feeling of I'm valuable to my tribe. And the more valuable you are to your tribe, the higher you raise in status. So virtue games are important because selflessness is important. Being giving is important. Not putting yourself first is important. But also following rules is important in human groups. Success games are important because, of course, if you're a great hunter, you're bringing back calories. If you're a great storyteller, that has value. If you're a great sweet potato finder, that has value. So that's how it worked. 20,000 years ago, before civilization. The more value you provided, the higher your status, and the higher your status, the more influence you had, the more food you had, the better food you had, the safer your sleeping sites, the greater your access to your choice of mates. And that's still true today. The more status we have in 2022, it's the same. The better food you have, the more food you have, the greater your access to choice of mates, the safer your sleeping sites. So human life hasn't changed. But we've evolved to crave status because it's this basic rule the subconscious brain knows and has been following for, thousands and thousands of years, which is go for status. Because if you go for status, everything else gets better.
Well-being follows status.
So, well-being is more complicated than just being attached to status. The other thing that is equally important, but isn't talked about quite so much because it's not about that, is you mentioned belongingness. Mm-hmm. So because we're tribal, we've evolved to some psychologists talk about getting along and getting ahead. So belongingness and status. We want people to like us and love us and accept us. So that's one set of motivations and incentives. But also, once we're in the group, nobody wants to be just considered likable but useless. That isn't what people want.
I know that guy.
Yeah, yeah. No one wants to be likable but useless. We want to be likable but valued. Feel like people are looking up to us, and so getting along and getting ahead. So we want to feel like we belong, and we want to feel like we're valued. Those are those two things, and obviously the book is mostly about the second thing, but the first thing is just as important.
Yeah, you write that once we join a group, we are rarely content to flop about on its lower rung.
Yeah.
So we don't want to. We there's this instinct to get ahead, and we all know people who have a more developed instinct to get ahead, perhaps a ruthless desire to succeed. What are the pros and cons of ambition inside of a group?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Well, because like all of these things, like everything, human brains don't come off the conveyor belt of Foxconn. We're not identical. Every human brain is different. It's not, sometimes we talk about humans as if we're all like the same thing, and it's just like we're not computers. So everyone's dials are set differently, and some people have relatively high need for status, and some people don't, and some people have really relatively high need for belongingness, and some people don't. So somebody obviously the first example everyone's going to think of is Donald Trump. Donald Trump has extremely high need for status. And actually, part of my work is I work as a ghostwriter. So I work with very, very successful individuals, writing their books for them. So I've had the kind of fascinating experience of getting to know really super successful people, and they are different to me. They are prepared to work longer hours. They are much more obsessed with things like where am I on the bestseller charts and how much money I've got. Their dials are set higher. And so sometimes they're quite difficult people to work with. They expect a lot and they're short-tempered or have minimal patience for failure. And so that's difficult. So some people, they become unpopular often, but also they are the ones that are changing the world and making a difference and creating jobs for other people. So, is it good or is it bad? I just think that's it's a too simplistic kind of lens through which to view all this. It's such complex stuff. But yeah, I think it's just the truth that the people who are really changing the world and making a difference are usually very high in need for status. Like Gandhi would have been very high in need for status, without a doubt. And they're both often doing incredible things. They're also often doing terrible things, like Putin and some politicians that we might feel like naming or maybe not. But they're also. Steve Jobs is a great example. Steve Jobs famously was apparently a very unpleasant man. If you read the Walter Isaacson biography, very difficult, very driven, extremely high need for status. But he changed the world. It was him that. Well, he didn't invent the iPhone, but he kind of led that project, didn't he?
Sure. Yeah. So ambition can lead to great innovation, but if we're too ambitious, we can get thrown out of the tribe. And that in ancient times led to death. Now it feels like social isolation.
That's right. Yeah. So when I was thinking about status and whether, the first thing you ask is it true this argument that status is so important to human beings? And I thought, well, if you're going to argue for a whole book that it's so important, figure out what happens when we lose status, because that's got to be quite bad. If it's this thing that's more important to us than gold and sometimes even life, it must be pretty bad when we lose it. And so I found this paper called Humiliation and Its Consequences. And these psychologists define humiliation as a loss of status that's so bad that your group basically expels you, that there's no chance that you're ever going to be able to claim status from that group in the future. So it's a terrible state of being if you consider how important our status is to us, to have that feeling that just we've been thrown out of the group and we just give up. Never come to us asking for status again, because you're never going to get it. And what you find is that humiliation is, so researchers call it the nuclear bomb of the emotions. It's like this unique, toxic and dangerous state. And humiliation is what connects things like serial killers to incels, to spree killers, to terrorists, to spies that spy against their country. It's even implicated in acts of genocide. It is a uniquely disastrous state of being for human beings, and that is, I argue, because it's a sudden and dramatic loss of status.
You talk about how modern people are more status oriented than those people from even a few decades ago, that the 1980s was some sort of inflection point in our orientation towards greed and fame and money. And this is all before social media. So first of all, what happened? What do you think has happened of the decades leading up to the early aughts? And then let's talk about the gasoline that social media has thrown on those instincts.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not sure that our need for status has gone up since the 80s, but I think the way that we're playing status games has changed. So if you change the rules of the game, you change what we have to do in order to earn status in it. And if you change how we're trying to earn status, you change us as a people. Like we kind of become the games we play. And it's really interesting when you look at how in the West, it's the economy, which is this great kind of huge force which controls so many of our status games. So before the 1980s, in between, say, the Great Depression and the Second World War in the early sort of mid-20th century, those kind of shocks knocked us in the West into this much more collective state. So we became much less individualist. So, the middle section of the 20th century in the US and in the UK was the time of, the welfare state, in the UK, healthcare for all. I was amazed to find out that in the US in the 50s, the top rate of tax was 91%. I mean, I'd associate 91% tax with almost a communist country, but that was how it was in the US. It was the top rate tax. It's extraordinary how collective we were in the West. The New Deal.
The New Deal, yeah.
So we became much more collective, and it worked for a while. But in the 70s, it all started going wrong. The economy started, falling to pieces, and so Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, at the same time, were confronted with the same problem, which was like the way that we're running the West is failing. We have to come up with a new idea, and the new idea that they came across was this philosophy called neoliberalism. And what neoliberalism essentially is like get rid of all that collective stuff and ramp up competition everywhere you can find it. So ramp it up. So getting rid of the collective stuff was things like attacking the unions. So in the UK, we had the miners' strikes. In the US, you had the air traffic controllers strikes, a big totemic battle with them. It's about getting rid of as many of the regulations on banking and business as you possibly can. It's about reducing the welfare state. It's about cutting the budgets for over here the National Health Service. So we want to redesign the money games of the West in such a way that you have to be competitive. And it worked. The creepy thing is, in 1981, Margaret Thatcher was interviewed about, what are you doing? What was this big project? And she said something like, the project is economic, but the object is to change the soul, which is just an incredibly sinister thing to say. But it's even more kind of chilling when you realize that she absolutely did that, and so did Ronald Reagan. So if you think about who we were as a people in the West in 1965, it was the hippie era, it was screw the man, it was smoking spliffs, anti-materialistic, very groupish. And then if you think about who we were in 1985 as a people, we were in Wall Street with the red braces, greed is good. Like that's what happened between 65 and 85. And what changed is the economy, neoliberalism. We had to become, in order to win status in the world, we had to become super competitive. So we became super competitive. The 80s was the era also of the keep fit revolution. So body image became a big thing in the 80s. And of course, it still is today. When you ask kids in the 80s versus the 70s what they wanted to be when they grew up, kids started to talk about money much more in the 80s. And then as that grew into the 90s and the aughts, it becomes celebrity. And we get the celebrity culture. So that to me is a really, I find it a fascinating example of how if you change the rules change the rules by which somebody earns status, the people change on a massive scale.
Well, and the scoreboard has changed as well, right? So today we have 24. We talked about the 24/7 news cycle back in the the 80s that changed the way news gets covered. But today, every individual has the opportunity to create their own curated version of themselves for all the world to see, and it's a nonstop, real-time scoreboard where I can see the number of likes I have, I can see the number of views of my reels, and everybody else can see them too, to some extent, right? And so, how does the scoreboard change the way we act, and really just increase the importance and hysteria around our own personal ambition and quest for status?
Yeah, so social media, of course, is the next big thing that happened. And we still live in the neoliberal era. We are, the Thatcher and Reagan era, continues. We're still living in this hyper-competitive, individualistic set of games. But social media has kind of concentrated that even more. I mean, social media is just a status. It's a huge global status game. That's why, the latest figures are that more than half the population of the world are on social media, which is just extraordinary. More than 4 billion or almost 4 billion people are on social media. So, so why is it so universally successful? Well, it's because it's a status game. I talked earlier on about those three human games: dominance, which is threat, aggression, coercion; virtue, which is morality, following the rules, enforcing the rules, believing the sacred beliefs. And then there's competence, success, my success markers, what I've achieved, the markers of my success, my holiday, my shoes, my watch. That's social media. Dominance, virtue, and success. That's what it is. And there's some belongingness in there too. Of course, Facebook does belongingness probably better than any other of the social media websites. But LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, it's dominance, virtue, and success. So it's quite an extraordinary thing, social media, and I think people maybe even underestimate its power, because what social media is, it's a brand new kind of universe by which we can earn status. So there are many people, I couldn't even begin to put a number on it, but many people around the world who have more status packed into that than they have in their real life. So they have, with the followers, like, so that is how important the social media game becomes to them, because most of their value is online, comes off a website. So I think those are the people that are, some of this would become incredibly wealthy, and famous off the back of social media. So it's this amazing new kind of universe by which we can mine this fantastically valuable and addictive resource.
You mentioned the person who's above it all, above being a status, person, and there's this breed of person who is all about mindfulness on social media, and their whole brand is tied into how mindful they are, and yet they're making like 5 different reels per day trying to talk about how mindful they are.
Yeah, the tail is in the behavior, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, if you really were above it all, you wouldn't. I don't think you'd be on social media. But
of course not.
Yes. There was a very funny study that I wrote about in the book where some psychologists in the Netherlands they found 3,700 people who practice mindfulness meditation specifically to reduce their status needs. I think they described it as ego needs, but same thing really. To kind of get over this constant need they had for validation and status and ego feeding. And they found that these people scored very high in what they described as spiritual superiority. So they were like answering questions like, if only everybody else had the insights I have, the world would be a much better place, and all this stuff, So the better they got at mindfulness meditation, the more arrogant they got, and the more superior they felt to the people around them. Like, and I love it because it's funny, because it's one of those classic things. It's funny because it's true. Like we laugh because it's absolutely predictable that people are going to do that because they're humans. That's what humans do.
Right. Yeah.
You're going to get good at this thing, and you're going to think, well, that makes me better than all these other people that don't figure out how smart I am and how great I am.
So it's easy to see the hypocrisy of virtue games on social media, but this is just the amplification of what's happened throughout history. Can you talk about how the quest for status via virtue manifests in religion and revolutions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this has been going on for as long as there have been people in the world. It's quite interesting when you look at the people who study the conditions under which revolutions tend to happen. And, from the outside, the expectation would be that revolutions happen when really poor people get sick of being really poor and overturn the really rich people. But actually, revolutions tend to happen in nations that have a much sort of bigger middle class. I mean, in Iran, it's looking like it's in a pre-revolutionary state at the moment. And if you see the women that are at the forefront of those protests, they're middle class women. And what it tends to be is when people's expected rewards fail to pay out. So even though they're middle class, relatively speaking, but by Western standards might be poor, they still feel like they're middle class and they are above these people down here. But when their expected rewards fail to pay out, then that's when the revolutions sort of tend to happen. So I thought that was really interesting. But I think the most interesting example I think there's 2 really interesting examples from history that go into in depth. The first one is Nazi Germany and how humiliation and status was so deeply implicated, not only in the rise of Hitler, but also in the genocide that happened during the Second World War. And the other really interesting example is communism. I mean, communism, I think, is especially interesting because that was literally a massive social experiment. The whole point of communism was we're going to redesign human society in such a way. We talked before about getting along and getting ahead. We're going to take the getting ahead stuff out. So it's only getting along. And that's what communism is. It's communal. So everything is shared. There's no private property. Everything is shared. The early kind of purist communists even talked about sharing partners and, families, but there being no such thing as the family and actually just everyone living in this perfect community. And that's actually the final chapter of the status game. It's called The Parable of the Communist, because it really brings in the whole theory and shows you why communism failed, because they made a basic error. Karl Marx and the early communists made a basic error. They thought that it was wealth that created the status, the need we have for status, and private property that created the need we have for status. So if you take away wealth and private property, nobody would crave status anymore. We'd all be happy being equally poor or whatever, equally. They envisioned equally rich, but as long as we were equal, that was fine. But of course, that's not true. What we know now is that the status craving is a fundamental part of our human nature, and you can't get rid of it. And that's what the communist experiment showed. I mean, they tried to get rid of the class system, but in the 1950s, a sociologist went to Soviet Union and found 12 distinct social classes in the Soviet Union, which is like more than we had in England at the time, which is like a class-bound culture. And all they did was they just flipped it. So the people that were at the top were now at the bottom, and the people who were at the bottom were now at the top. And that's always what happens with these utopian movements. I would argue, and it's probably a little bit controversial, but I would argue that a lot of the social justice, on the extremes of the social justice movements we have today in the US, the UK, and Canada, that's what they're doing too. They talk about equality, but it's not about equality. It's about flipping the game. So the people who they perceived were at the top are now at the bottom, and vice versa.
You say the ultimate purpose of status games is control, and you see that at the extremes of social justice and of the complementary efforts on the other side of the political spectrum, right? Absolutely. So they say they're fighting for principle, but they're fighting for control. And you say utopians talk of injustice while building new hierarchies and placing themselves on top. And in the effort to get themselves on top, they utilize the weapons of shame and humiliation to cast out their enemies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where they earn their virtue status. And I think one of the things that really sort of made a big impact on me when I was doing my research was that I'm by instinct and experience instinctively a left-wing person. So my implicit assumption has always been, well, the virtue people are the good people that are changing the world. Success people, the evil capitalists, they're the villains, right? Yes, so because it seems obvious, of course that's true. But actually, when you think about it, who is changing the world? Is it the Pope and Michelle Obama, or is it Steve Jobs and AstraZeneca or Moderna, whoever's inventing the COVID vaccine? Who is lifting billions of people out of poverty in Asia? Is it the capitalists, or is it the Pope, Gandhi, Mother Teresa? It's the capitalists. It's the people who are playing these success games. So I've gone off the question slightly, but it was just to say that the kind of virtue thing is this huge double-edged sword. Like when we think of virtue, we think of unalloyed good, but virtue is always in the context of your group. So when you've got social justice people or Trumpy people or however you want to describe them, they feel virtuous when they're fighting on behalf of the moral code of their group. But it's a local moral code. So, it almost seems banal to say, but of course Hitler thought he was a good guy. Hitler thought he was morally good. So did Lenin, so did Stalin, just because you think you are. But it's always local to your group. So it's a kind of, yeah.
So along those lines, and the reason they get followers is because the games that Hitler was playing served the people that were winning at those games. We will believe any dream of reality if our status depends on it. And you can see that in whatever political, whatever religious, whatever in capitalism could be described as a religion, right? If you're succeeding at capitalism, you're sure as shit going to believe in it, right?
Absolutely, because your status depends on believing it. There was a really interesting researcher in the 70s called Jerome Burkow who went to Africa and was interested in why people were joining Islam, is the religion of Islam, but also joining jihad. And a lot of these people were former royalty. So what had happened was that they had been aristocrats in this city it was called Katanga, and the jihadists came in and got rid of the aristocracy, got rid of the royalty, and created an Islamic state. So, and his question was, so why are these guys who used to be royal, had all their status taken away, why are they joining why are they joining Islam? You'd think they'd be against it. And so he interviewed a whole bunch of these people, and he said, well, Islam, he didn't use this is my phrasing, but Islam is a status game. Like people want status, and it was the only way that you could earn status in that society. So that's the game that you were going to play. So what you found was that these kind of, former royalty and descendants of former royalty would become incredibly zealous Muslims, and would spend hours learning the holy books, and going through all the rituals. And he had this great phrase where he'd say that the beliefs that they followed were their criteria for claiming status. So they had to believe they were true because that was their criteria for claiming status. And that's why religious people get so deeply offended when you say all this stuff is not true, because you're not attacking their religion, you're attacking who they are. You're not attacking the status of Muhammad or Jesus or Buddha. You're attacking their personal status, because that belief is their criteria for claiming status. And of course, that maps onto capitalists, that maps onto social justice warriors and Trumpists and Brexit people over here. The belief is their criteria for claiming status, which is why when you attack it, it's so deeply personal to people, and people become so irrationally emotional and irrationally defensive of those beliefs.
Let's talk about the insatiability of our need for status. You tell you share an anecdote about Paul McCartney in the book, which was really eye-opening to me. Will you recount that for us?
Yeah, so I like this story because Paul McCartney, he has a reputation of just being a nice guy. Like he's not like a sort of prima donna at all. He's not like a Kanye or a Meghan Markle. He's just a nice guy, and he's quite astonishing because Paul McCartney's probably had more status than almost anyone alive. Like
who can you think of who's got more status than Paul McCartney?
He's just unbelievable.
He's a Beatle, and he's the good-looking, sensitive Beatle, right?
Yeah, like it's unbelievable the amount of status that guy has drunk through, since he was.
Elton John wishes he was Paul McCartney.
Absolutely right, and you can imagine, Prince, like King Charles now, or like Barack Obama feeling, oh my God, it's Paul McCartney. He's up there, right? But what I loved about it was I heard this. I met this guy who's one of these Beatles obsessives, and he told me, do you know that Paul McCartney has this obsession with whose name comes first on the credits on the records? Because when him and John Lennon first got together, for some reason, when they were still like playing in the bedroom, they agreed that no matter who wrote the song, it would always say by Lennon and McCartney, with Lennon's name first. And so that over the years has driven McCartney to absolute distraction. And he's had several attempts at trying to negotiate a fairer way of of crediting this stuff, even to the extent where when he would do a live album, when there'd be a Paul McCartney live album that had some Beatles covers on, he'd credit them to McCartney and Lennon, and then Yoko Ono goes mad and starts kicking off, because that's her status that's being attacked. So I just thought it was just hilarious, but also deeply telling that somebody as nice as Paul McCartney, and who has had so much status, is still driven to distraction by this silly little thing that all the songs are credited to Lennon and McCartney and not McCartney-Lennon.
So what do we do about it, Will? Like, I mean, I'm aware of it in my own life, and I know it drives me crazy. I know it makes me less happy when I obsess on it. So what are the steps with? How do you harness it to live a more productive life, and how do you moderate it to not drive yourself bananas?
So I think the first thing is to be careful of your virtue games. Like, I think that's really important. I think virtue is really seductive because it's the easiest form of status to get. I mean, if you're like a tough guy, then dominant status is the easiest form to get. But if you're just like a middle class book reader like me, dominance is necessary. But for most of us,
I have read almost 48 books this year, and that is a source of my status, isn't it?
If I tried pushing somebody around, it wouldn't go very well. For most of us, virtue is the easiest. I mean, especially with social media. I mean, to earn a bit of virtue status, all you got to do is find somebody that's playing a different status game to you on social media and attack them in front of all your friends. And all your friends are going to go, "Yeah, you told him. But you haven't done anything. As a friend of mine said recently, all you've done is move your thumb. That's literally what you've done. So I think they're really dangerous, and they're also seductive because when we think of virtue, we forget that the virtue is local to our group. And actually, when we're playing these virtue games, we might feel like Michelle Obama in the moment, but how do we know that we're not Putin or Lenin or one of these other people that were equally convinced of their moral status, but actually history,
or just one of their useful idiots, right?
Yeah, well, even worse. Yeah. So be careful of the virtue game, and actually, I think pursue the success game. I mean, and if you're a left-wing minded person like me, it feels paradoxical, but once you just look at the world, it's inarguably true that if you want to change the world, you've got to work on your competence. You've got to focus your life on becoming really good at something, and if you do that, things will generally go well for you. It's as simple as that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, like, in terms of sort of hedging and making sure that the status game doesn't, because the problem with status is that it never ends. Like, it's not like if you want to pursue happiness, then belongingness is a much better thing, to focus on, even though you still need the status. But status gives us meaning. It gives us moments of intense joy. It also gives us moments of intense despair, but it never gives us the feeling of satisfaction. Like, the status game never ends. Like, you never, like as the Paul McCartney instance shows, when psychologists try to find the place where our need for status levels off, they can't find it. And that's different to power. When they're people, like, contrary to what you might expect, people's need for power tails off quite quickly, because unless they are like a world leader focused type of person who really wants power. There's a tiny number of people, most of us, because with power does come responsibility and work and stress. And most people are just like, oh, I don't want this. I don't want all this power. So generally speaking, our need for power levels off, but the need for status never does, and it kind of moves up in small degrees. So we move up a little bit and we go, oh, this is good. Then we want a bit more. We want a bit more. So our life is vulnerable when we basically just play one game. When we play one status game, it's good in a way because all of our efforts are focused on becoming excellent at this one status game, but we're incredibly vulnerable because if things go wrong, or if, as we get older, younger, more ambitious rivals come up and start threatening and overtaking us, we're really vulnerable because because our status game is our identity. So if you take, if all I am is a writer and you take that away from me, I'm going to become mentally ill. I'm going to have a nervous breakdown, and I'm not exaggerating. You like that. That's why people who get cancelled or whatever suffer so terribly. It's not the loss of the money; it's the loss of identity. It's the loss of their status. So I think that the other sort of bit of advice in the book I give is play many games. It's no coincidence that psychologists find that people who are emotionally more stable are members of multiple groups. And I believe that what the groups are obviously offering them belongingness, but they're also offering them status. And if you're a member of many groups, you're playing many games, then you're hedging. You're in a much more secure position.
So those groups might be the place where I work, or the industry I'm a part of, the religion I'm a part of, my weekend lacrosse organization, or whatever. What other areas of my life can I find to join groups?
Any group in which you feel like you are being of value counts. So literally, as a direct result of this book, like when I wrote this book, I realized that I was the nightmare it's describing because I don't have children. So all I do is work. Like, I've got my wife and she works hard too, and I don't. It's like, Jesus, like, you don't do anything for anyone apart from your dogs.
Oh, I'll argue. No, your work is service. I do believe your work is service.
Yeah, yes, but it's vulnerable because it was my only really source of status. So I've started volunteering at a charity. I don't know if you have it in the US, called the Samaritans, where people. I'm still training, but it's basically you phone up if you're in despair, and they save lives. It's famously people who are suicidal phone up, and you have to do things like people phone up when they're in the middle of dying, and you have to be there with them while they die. So it's really intense and difficult. and it sounds awfully selfish, but I'm trained to be a Samaritan because I'm hedging. I need more status games to play, and like it sounds so cynical, but it really isn't, because the need for status is a fundamental human need, and everybody who's being trained with me right now, they're all in it for the same reason. It's just that the difference is they're not conscious of it. They say, right. "Oh, I just want to help. I want to give back." But yeah, you do. That's true. You do want to help and you do want to give back, but that's because you're getting that feeling of being virtuous.
So being mindful, and I don't mean being performatively mindful or performatively virtuous, but being mindful of the status games that we're playing can help us make better decisions and just sort of evaluate our success or lack thereof in each of those games.
Absolutely, and I think the big thing to embrace is don't condescend to status. When you think about a status pursuit, don't look down your nose at it, because you need it too. It's fun. It's a part of our human nature. Yes, it can be shallow and stupid and embarrassing, but it's also many or most of the greatest, most profound, meaningful, memorable moments of our life have are moments of sudden increased status. Like, we need it. People who change the world and do incredible things are motivated by the need for status. So in the book I describe it as this kind of social vitamin. It's like an essential vitamin that we need. We don't get it from food or the sun. We get it from our groups. But without it, we become depressed. We become even physically unwell. So the number one thing is to take it seriously. Like, it really matters.
And if I find myself feeling self-conscious about my relative lack of status with other people in any certain group, how do I rationalize that? And rationalization might be a pejorative word there. I mean, how do I process that and take a healthy approach to it?
Yeah. So I think it's one of those things where, like Carl Jung said, when you make you should always try and make the unconscious conscious, and just simply by doing that helps. Understanding why you're feeling uncomfortable really helps. And it is things like, say if you're naturally, I'm naturally quite a scruffy person, and before knowing about this, going somewhere, I might have rationalized to myself, well, why should I spend all this money on clothes? It doesn't matter. It's just clothes. It doesn't matter. But now I understand, well, actually, if I go into a group and I look scruffy, people are going to be looking at me, and I'm going to sense that they're thinking, who is this scruffy git? And that's going to make me feel bad. So it matters. So when you look at stuff through the lens of status, so many things that didn't once make sense suddenly make sense, and you understand why they're important. That's why I should make an effort in doing these things. And I think if you're chronically deprived of status in any group, you should just leave the group. Like, you kind of have to leave the group, find something else to do. And don't get too hung up with money either, because the evidence, the data is absolutely consistent that it's not money that makes us happy. It's status. We haven't evolved to crave money. Money hasn't been around long enough. We've evolved to crave status, and money is just one marker of status. So it is much better. You talk about the big fish in the small pond. It's always better to be the bigger fish in the smaller pond, because that's what the brain wants to see. And when the brain, when that status detection system detects that we are a relatively big fish, it's going to think, oh, I'm thriving, I'm happy, things are good, and we're going to feel happier, and we're going to get healthier mentally and physically.
The book is called The Status Game, and unless you're in the UK, where it's called The Status Game. And the author is my guest today, Will Storr. Will, where can our listeners find out more about you and your work?
Well, best place is Twitter, I would say, at WStorr, which is WSTORR.
Hey, man, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for your work in this book.
No, thanks for your great questions, Paul. I had a great fun talking to you. Thank you.
Hey, everybody, if you like what we're up to here at Crazy Money, do us and yourself a favor by following the show on your favorite podcast app and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Also, click the link in the show notes to subscribe to my new Substack, where you'll get bi-weekly thoughts on the role of money in our world and in our lives directly to your email inbox. Thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next week.